We're planning. Okay, got it. We're all here to kind of go over the overview of the summer sampling that was undertaken in 2022 for the systems around the vineyard that have been getting sampled for years now. And honestly, I'm really so pleased that this program is still going, because as Sherry, you well know, it was a challenge to get it up and running, but we did manage to get it up and running. And we've managed to sort of keep it going. And I think it's a very valuable program for the island as a whole. This is basically no different than in previous years, laying out the goals of the program, essentially really to keep a handle on the nutrient-related water quality of all of the estuaries of the vineyard in each of the towns, essentially track changes over time to embayment health as it relates to nutrient concentrations, and also track changes that may be occurring as a result of actions in the watershed to reduce loads or any modifications to inlets or openings that then also have bearing on water quality conditions in the various estuaries. The sampling, this is no different from year to year. It's the whole suite of nutrients assays, nitrogen assays, and phosphorus assays as well. Ammonia, NOx, which is nitrate, DON, PON, POC, orthophosphate, chlorophyll, and phaeophytin, which are really indicators of habitat health, and then physical parameters, including dissolved oxygen observations, temperature, salinity, whatnot. So all of these have been getting sampled year to year, no different year to year, to be able to cross-compare each system and stations within the system. As you know, this is the breadth of the program, but for Little Oyster Pond, these have been getting monitored every year going back to, I think we started in 2016 or 2017, Sherry. Some of them 2016, yeah. Some of them we stopped sampling for a year or so just because, like for instance, Cape Pogue and Pochette, they were generally, excuse me, in good shape. And so it was like, all right, well, maybe we don't have to sample it this year. Maybe we'll sample it every other year or every 2 years. And, you know, in the conversation we just had recently, we were thinking that for some of these systems that haven't been sampled in a year or two, then it's on time to go ahead and sample them. And so we're going to do that going into 23. So I think what we're going to do is just kind of like march through system by system, and until we get through them all, and hopefully not get too bogged down. But if there are clarification questions needed along the way, then chime in. Otherwise, we can go all the way through to the end and then answer any questions that come up for a particular system at that point. So this is Tisbury, Tajmu. It shows generally the location of the various stations, as well as the Massachusetts Estuaries Project Sentinel Station, which is this one down here. I don't know if you see my cursor dancing around the Sentinel Station. It's at the head of the system. And yeah, and there were a couple stations that, you know, we discontinued mainly because we just felt like the ones that we are doing now were sufficient for our purposes. So this is, I'm going to focus mainly on total nitrogen and chlorophyll. So this is the total nitrogen plot for Tajmu for all the years since inception of the program. And this is obviously the head of the system, the Sentinel Station, furthest away from the inlet on this end. This is closest to the inlet. And so like you see that the closer you get to the inlet, the better the water quality is from a TN point of view, mainly because it's well flushed with lower nutrient water coming in from the sound. Sentinel Station you'll notice is bouncing around the threshold level nutrient concentration that was set during the Massachusetts Estuaries Project of 0.36, and 2022 lower than 2021. And there's this sort of period of time where it's dancing around the threshold and below the threshold. Here, the majority of the system below the Sentinel station looks like it's trending downwards and staying below the threshold. So for the purposes of the program, it really should continue to be monitored, because these ups and downs dancing around the threshold, are indicative of natural variability. But the fact of the matter is, between the load coming in and the flushing from the sound, it's still bouncing at times above the threshold. So it's not to say that this system is set, but the lower parts of the system are definitely looking pretty nice. And Sherry, I think you mentioned to me that it seemed like eelgrass was kind of making a bit of a comeback, or was that lagoon?
Around site 21, where it's very shallow, we've seen some really healthy beds.
Yeah.
It is still existing around Sentinel and 4, but it's really stressed. It's got a lot of epiphytes. It's got a lot of dead growth on it. So it's struggling there because it's deeper and it's not getting the sunlight it needs.
Yeah. So the system, the system generally seems to be hanging in there, but the fact that the concentrations up at the top are still bouncing up and down around the threshold, a little bit above, a little bit below, would indicate that there still needs to be, work done here. Chlorophyll in 2022 significantly lower than in 2021. 2021 was an odd year. All the systems seem to show pretty high chlorophyll, and I think it might really have been because of environmental conditions across the entire area, not specific to a particular estuary in and of itself. But the fact that the chlorophylls are as low as they are in 2022, at least is a good sign, as opposed to them being well beyond the 10 microgram per liter threshold. Lagoon Pond, Sentinel stations up in the upper part, LGP2. We've maintained the gradient, the stations in a manner to be able to resolve the gradient from top to bottom. This is what the TN concentrations look like across all the stations over all the years from 2016 to present. And it's actually really pretty nice. It may very well be that loading to the system itself may not have changed that much over the last handful of years, but the system may also be responding to any modifications that have been made to the inlet or the dredging of the channel under the bridge. And I think some work was done down there. Is that right, Sherry?
Yes, several years ago, the drawbridge was, the channel was deepened and widened.
Yeah. So that being the case, what we're seeing here is probably a response to that, more so than a reduction in load, because I don't know what has been done in the watershed to significantly reduce the load to the system. So all of this is actually looking really rather nice, in the sense that it seems like all of the stations generally are below the threshold. And that's something to keep in mind, in the sense that, maybe next year, whether it's this summer or summer 2024, we might start to look at doing some measurements of habitat indicators of health and see what that tells us and how well it pairs to the TN concentrations and the chlorophyll concentrations, all of which generally seem to stay below that 10 microgram per liter threshold. That's an indicator of impairment, of habitat impairment. And then see about potentially approaching the DEP with the information that we have on habitat health, whether it's DO, chlorophyll, benthic and fauna, and then open up the discussion as to whether or not the system should remain on the list of impaired waters. This is the same as before. It's just that we used to sample LGP 11 and 12, which are actually down here. I think they were down here, right, Sherry? South End Basin.
Yeah, that's where site 11 is.
Right. And where was 12?
12 was actually in Mud Creek.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it was farther up in.
And so that's why, that's why these look the way they do, because of where the stations were located. They're not really in the body of the estuary, and obviously, are relatively high, as would be sort of expected. And similarly, is the corresponding chlorophyll. It's titled total pigment because it's actually a combination of chlorophyll and phaeophytin. Phaeophytin being the byproduct of the decomposition. The breakdown of chlorophyll is to phaeophytin. Put the two together as total pigment. Oak Bluffs Harbor. Essentially, we've reduced the sampling to primarily the Sentinel station. It used to be that we sampled 15, 16, and 17 as well as 14. We stopped sampling 15 and 16 just because the waters of Oak Bluffs Harbor are generally so good because of the size of the body of water and also because of the direct flushing with the sound. And
yeah, the jetty was improved and the town has put the sewer in.
Yeah. And so focusing in on the Sentinel station, which is, I believe it's in Sunset Lake. What you see here is year on year, there is a little bit of variability, natural variability from, like say 2021 and 2020, but, generally we're gradually staying below the threshold at Sunset Lake. And that's a good sign. Maybe it's responding to some of the sewering that was done. Maybe there's a little bit of improved flushing of Sunset Lake with whatever improvements may have come as a result of modifying the jetty. And so maybe a little bit cleaner water is pushing up into Sunset Lake, which may be sort of driving some of the reductions that we're seeing here. But again, it could also be that the system might be starting to see some of the activities that have taken place in the watershed to Oak Bluffs Harbor and Sunset Lake. And I don't know the extent of the sewering that was done, Sherry, but it might be that, it's reduced the loads enough.
The sewering was done in all of the downtown area. Mm-hmm. And it was done before I was here. So it was 12, 15 years ago.
Yeah. Okay. But I mean, it could also be that there's a lag between when something is done and when it might show up in a receiving water. So it could be that, we're seeing a little bit of that effect, possibly, and in combination with maybe a little bit of improvement being driven from, flushing related effects. But again, I don't think that Oak Bluffs Harbor is on the list of impaired waters. I'd be surprised if it was. But I think it's worth continuing to monitor it. Maybe not every year, but maybe every other year, just to keep track on what the concentrations are doing over time, and make sure that they actually stay below the threshold level of set by the Estuaries Project, less than 0.45 milligrams per liter. And this is the corresponding chlorophyll. Again, you see in 2021 a very big spike, and it's present throughout all of the estuaries, it seems. So So I think that it's really some regional environmental condition, whether it was overly cloudy summer or maybe overly dry or overly wet or something like that. But you see that the chlorophylls in 2022 and 2020 were generally staying low. Farm pond, these are the stations, but in 2022, it was not sampled. And that's one of the systems that got, like, I guess, for lack of a better word, a gap year. And based on our discussion, Sherry, of the other day, it's looking like we will sample farm pond in 2023 to see how it might compare to 2021, which was, I believe, the last time that farm pond was sampled, either 2021 or 2022.
Yeah, we will be sampling farm pond again because hopefully the culvert is finally going to go in. So it's really important to see the before and after.
Yeah, absolutely. And that brings us to Senjik and Tackett. And there's two Sentinel stations that were established by the Estuaries Project, one up in the head of Majors Cove and one right where, I guess it's Traps Pond discharges to Senjik and Tackett. A couple stations were taken out that were closest to the inlet. SKT5 was kept because, in a way, it's sort of like the best a station could get. So it's sort of like an end member. Overall, let's see, in Majors Cove, we're still seeing some exceedance of the threshold. 2022 is better than 2021, but 19, 20, and 21 were above. 18 was below. So, there's still something going on relative to loads and flushing. This system and, a number of the others like Tisbury Grape Pond and Showmark Pond, I believe, really are very sensitive to flushing. The loads, are not likely changing very much year on year, but what can change pretty noticeably, as like is the case in Katama, is what happens to the flushing, to the inlets, how well they flush, or if an inlet has opened or closed. And I think Senjik and Tackett, Senj, is one of those systems where, depending on what's going on with those inlets, you can see it translate into the nutrient concentration. So Majors Cove is still sort of hovering around the threshold, and Traps Pond is still consistently above the threshold. So really the system needs to continue to be managed and monitored. Again, you see in 2021 how the chlorophylls were all very, very high, but in 2022 they're noticeably lower, which in a way is a good thing. But from a nutrient concentration point of view, the Sentinel stations still show, that work needs to be done to either maintain flushing or improve flushing, make sure that those inlets are effective, and also continue to try and reduce load from the watershed itself. Katama. My understanding is that the second inlet, which opened up down here on the southern end of the system, is now closed. So that could have a pretty noticeable effect on concentrations at the stations in this lower part of the system. And
Roland, it was closed, but now it's been blown back open. So it's open now.
oh, okay, so
it'll be interesting to see, because the nitrogen was creeping up at some of the sites.
Yeah,
you'll see.
That's what it looked like. 2021, was higher than 20. which was higher than 19, generally speaking. So was it open in 2022 or did it just open?
It was closed in 2022.
Okay.
It opened, I think, in the fall.
Okay. Well, that 2022 is less than 2021 in certain places and not in or the same in others. You know, could very well be just natural variability, but with that second southern inlet opening up again, it really would be important to continue to monitor the system for change and improvement. I would imagine improvement, because again, these ponds are so sensitive to flushing, and the lower TN in 2022 is also paired with lower chlorophyll in 2022, which, you know, stands to reason. But for sure, I think that the fact that the southern inlet has opened up again works in this overall system's favor. Eggertown Gray Pond. So this was really interesting this past summer 2022, in the sense that TN is really just gone off the charts relative to the threshold, whereas in the previous years it was hovering at below or just below or slightly above the threshold. And having talked through this with Sherry, it really seems that what's driving this is the fact that there was either an opening that wasn't able to happen, or if it did happen, it was a very weak opening. I think it just didn't happen. It was like maybe what opening was it? I think a spring opening or summer opening. Sherry,
I'm sorry?
Which opening was it in Eggertown Great Pond that didn't happen? Was it a summer opening or a spring opening?
The summer opening didn't happen. It was very late because there just was no head. There was no way to open it.
Yeah. So, you know, therein lies part of the challenge, you know, the systems, because loads are just consistently what they are year on year, unless something significant has happened in the watershed to reduce the load, which then takes time to show up in the concentrations in the estuary itself. The next main driver of improvement or maintenance of good is these openings and the flushing. And this is a, you know, in my mind, a perfect example where, you know, the summer opening couldn't occur, you know, through no fault of anyone's, you know, but nature, and not providing the conditions required to be able to push an opening. But you can see how susceptible the systems are to those openings and the lack of flushing that comes when one opening isn't achievable. And it's seen again in the total pigment concentrations across all the stations in Eggertown Great Pond. So it really, I think it really underscores the point that these openings are really critical management tool for maintaining the health and the steady improvement of nutrient-related water quality conditions in the estuaries. And I think that, if I remember correctly, that is similarly the case with Chilmark Pond. We've essentially maintained all the stations but for one, and added one in the upper portion of Chilmark Pond. And what you see is 2022 compared to 2021 is noticeably different. Overall, the system still is well beyond its threshold at most of the stations in most of the years. But the fact that 2022 is the way it is may literally correspond to the fact that maybe an opening was not achieved, because again, like Edgartown Great Pond, the conditions weren't there to be able to open it up. And that might also have been the case in 2020. And that's easy enough to go back into the record and check to see how many openings were achieved in 2020. But you see again, the chlorophyll levels also correspond to the fact that an opening wasn't maybe as effective or achievable in 2022 compared to 2021. Tisbury Great Pond, I think, mirrors Chilmark Pond and Edgartown Great Pond in terms of its response. Sherry, can you confirm as to whether or not an opening was achieved in Tisbury Great Pond?
Tisbury Great Pond was the same way as Edgartown. It was open late.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that being said, it shows up in the TN concentrations at all the stations in 2022. So the system as a whole still really kind of dances around the threshold. The threshold, there's no specific sentinel station in Tisbury Great Pond, but rather it's an average of 3 critical stations, 4, 5, and 6. And what you notice is that in each case, 4, 5, and 6, it's really sort of dancing up and around the threshold. So if you were to like average these out over the course of the years, you're still above the threshold. So it's a load and then it's a flushing challenge in Tisbury Great Pond. And chlorophyll was, not too bad, generally below the 10 microgram per liter threshold. But it wouldn't have been surprising if it were a little bit higher in 2022. And I mean, it's still higher than in 2021, but it wouldn't have been surprising if it were even a bit higher than 10 micrograms per liter. Now, Menemsha and Squibnocket, it's sort of like a tale of two estuaries in a way, because Squibnocket is so very different than Menemsha, and Squibnocket is so very influenced by the limited exchange that it has with Menemsha through this tidal channel connection. But what we find is, let's start with Menemsha, and then over here is Squibnocket. Generally in 2022 was lower than in 2021, and it seems to be, sort of trending downwards, sort of trending downwards. I mean, 2021, I don't know exactly what was going on there at that point. There is some natural variability year on year, but in general, things tend to be trending downwards. And I think there was some significant dredging that occurred in the lower part of Menemsha in the inlet channel. Isn't that right, Sherry?
The jetty was opened, yes, and then the herring run was open between Menemsha and Squibnocket last year.
Yeah, last year it was. I don't know that Squib is really seeing the effects of that modification to the herring run just yet, just because 21 and 22 are really so similar that they're basically just the same. It'd be interesting to see what Squib does in 2023. And I guess part of the reason why the herring run, was modified, other than to improve the herring run, is to try and get a little bit of the cleaner water from Menemsha to push up into Squibnocket itself. But as you can see, Squibnocket is regularly, consistently well above its threshold, but it's not for, I think, load reasons, because I mean, there's just not that much development in the watershed to Squibnocket. I think it's a flushing issue, you know, and an exchange issue with Menemsha. And I don't know that Squib has ever had an opening to the Atlantic Ocean, naturally or artificial, but I venture to guess that if Squib were ever opened, you know, kind of like the way Tisbury, Chilmark, Edgartown are periodically opened, that it would significantly change the TN concentrations in Squib. Now, there may be reasons why, you know, that shouldn't happen, but if it did happen, it, I think, would be a measurable change in the concentrations within Squib. And I think Squib is really beholden to Menemsha and the herring run, you know. But Menemsha is looking actually really, really good, and like it's responded to the modifications to the jetty and the inlet and whatnot. Those are the chlorophyll concentrations. Menemsha's really low and indicative of clear water. Squib's better than it was in 2021, and it's certainly lower than the 10 microgram per liter threshold. So that's, you know, that's a good sign. But I don't know how much better Squib could ever get unless, you know, the exchange with Menemsha is increased. And that brings us to James Pond, which never did get a Massachusetts Estuaries Project analysis. So there is no threshold for it. Year on year, it seems to be kind of trending upwards from 2019 or 2018 to now. And literally, I think that's just because of what may be happening to the inlet to James Pond. And I mean, it's not even really an inlet. Isn't it like a culvert or something? If I remember correctly, it's a small culvert.
It's a small serpentine kind of culvert.
Yeah. And it may be that culvert is getting less and less effective at being able to pass water in and out of James Pond. And so as a result, you're just gradually seeing concentrations creep up, and, you know, they're getting on pretty high, you know, 0.9 is high. It's getting close to that. It's between 0.8 and 0.9. And so that's something that really needs to be paid attention to. So continuing to monitor, you know, is important, but, you know, just monitoring and see the concentrations creep upwards is, in a way, not very satisfying. Something should probably be done, and in order to keep that from continuing to happen. And again, you know, it's sort of like, how are you going to do it? You're either going to do it by reducing loads, or you're going to do it by improving the exchange, or both. And so in this case, I think it really, you might just get the biggest bang for your buck by finding a way to deal with improving the exchange through that culvert and seeing how that translates into changes in the concentrations before you start, you know, really doing the heavy lifting of how to reduce, you know, the biggest part of the loading pie, whatever it may be, because I don't know the answer to that, because we didn't do an estuaries project analysis, so we don't know what that loading pie looks like. And the loading pie being the watershed load based on land use distribution. So without that information, you know, if I were to look at this and have to, you know, decide what to do, I'd be like, well, let's see if we can't take a closer look at that culvert and how it exchanges water and do something about that. chlorophyll generally lower, but again, up and down. And that doesn't, that's not surprising because I mean, environmental conditions change year to year. And so chlorophyll total pigment sort of bounces up and down year to year. Wow, that's all of them. Okay. So, made some of these summary slides for the benefit of those that aren't in attendance, just kind of summarizing what we already sort of talked about. So I'm not gonna spend too much time on regurgitating what we already discussed. But it's here for people who aren't here watching this today. So it's just a summary of the systems. And if you want to, I can go through them system by system, but literally we just did that. So I'm happy to answer questions on any of the various systems that we went through, but from a recommendations point of view, I do believe that we should continue this program because it was a lot of effort to get it off the ground. I think it's generating some really good data and some good information and is a way to track what's happening in the system year on year. Dissolved oxygen is a very significant indicator of ecological health. And in certain systems, that are really sort of staying below the threshold at the Sentinel station, we might want to consider putting out dissolved oxygen and chlorophyll moorings to measure at a high frequency over a month or 2 month period what's happening with the DO and chlorophyll at those Sentinel stations that are in systems that look like they're meeting their thresholds, because that will give us a good indication as to habitat health. You could also sample for benthic infauna, the animals that live in the bottom, because they're also very good indicators of habitat health. But putting out moorings is a little bit easier, I think, and less expensive way of getting your first look at habitat health. Really
That'd be a good way, cheaper, good way to start, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And if then you combine that data with the trend of concentrations over the years as a way to open up the discussion with DEP relative to listing of a system on the list of impaired waters, they may come back and be like, well, what does the benthic infauna say? Or not, and then if they do, then you go and you make the effort to collect information on the animals that are living on the bottom, and then compare that with the oxygen, the chlorophyll, the concentrations, and then you have the whole package, and then you can figure out a way forward. It is really important to track the opening efforts because, as you see on some of these systems, the concentrations are really impacted by the efficacy of the opening, efficacy being the duration of the exchange, as well as the frequency of the openings. And missing an opening, unfortunately, sometimes nature doesn't provide the conditions to do an opening, but to the extent that it does, they really should be achieved, and also but tracked in the sense that track the conditions that the opening is occurring under, to then be able to evaluate when would be the best, under what conditions would be the best time to open up a system. Sometimes there's discussion about reducing the level of sampling. This is something that Sherry and I, go to Matt on every year, because it is time consuming, it is costly, it is challenging to coordinate. particularly because you have to be specific to the tides. To the extent that sampling could be or reduced, it's always really better to default towards fewer events, not fewer stations. Always maintain the same number of stations in the system, because it's those stations that enable you to resolve gradients to see how things are changing from the head of the system to the inlet. But you might be able, in some instances, to get away with maybe not having 4 or 5 events in the summer, but possibly, 3 events in the summer. And that's important. And that's basically point 4 and 5. Again, certain systems that weren't sampled in a given year, it may be on time to do it, like Cape Pogue and Pochit. And then again, and also some systems that are showing, consistent concentrations below the MEP threshold, it may be on time to start looking at doing a little bit more habitat-oriented data collection through the DO chlorophyll moorings or benthic in fauna, in order to really understand how the habitat itself is responding to the fact that concentrations at the sentinel stations are staying below the threshold.
Well, that's one of the issues that I've been having, is like we're hovering around the TMDL, but I'm not seeing the system respond. So that's where the DO meter would come in.
Yeah, I mean, but it's just system responds in different ways. I mean, it depends on what you're looking at. If you're just looking at eelgrass, that may take a long time to come back, or improve. But DO and chlorophyll, you might see the improvement much more immediately. Similarly, it might be that the benthic in fauna may respond before the eelgrass responds, what types of species are there, and is it shifting towards something that is indicative of better health, or is it shifting towards something that is indicative of lower health? So these are all things that can be considered. And again, I think it's an incremental process in terms of deciding how much more data to collect beyond just the water quality monitoring data that we get every summer. So with all that being said, I mean, we kind of raced through a lot of material. I would just at this point invite people to ask questions, and I do my best to answer them with the understanding that I have, and I'm not making any excuses, but I'm no Brian, and that man, to his credit, in respect to him, had just an infinite well of knowledge regarding these estuarine systems of the Vineyard and Nantucket and southeastern Massachusetts in general. We truly miss his brilliance, and I'll do my best to answer whatever questions you have. And if I don't have the answer to the question, then it's recorded and noted, and we can always reach out to the other members of the Coastal Systems Program team that also have a breadth of knowledge that would be useful to try and be able to answer the question. We just circle back to you with that. So there you go.
Thank you, Roland.
You're welcome.
Bill, I saw your hand up a while ago. There you go. And I see it again.
Before I jumped the gun in terms of when you're talking about the Sunset Lake and Oak Bluffs Harbor,
Mm-hmm.
and the decrease there. There was improvement of the stormwater runoff along New York Avenue, but
Okay.
I don't know that that would affect, would that affect the nitrogen much?
I mean, it
Stormwater?
could. I mean, it could, because I mean,
Yeah.
everything that flows into a system does have nutrient load, you know, to varying degrees. I mean, look, even when it rains directly onto the water body, that's a nutrient load. You know, it might not be
Okay.
very much. It might not be very much compared to the land generated load, but it's most certainly a load. And wet deposition and dry deposition is something that in the estuaries project we did have to quantify as part of the loading analysis to the estuary. It wasn't just the surface water runoff, it wasn't just the groundwater, it wasn't just the flux from the sediments, but or what was coming in on the tide from the ocean. It was also, you know, storm water, and it was also wet and dry atmospheric deposition. So it could very well be that, you know, slight changes in stormwater making its way into Sunset Lake could potentially be representative of a slight load reduction in that, you know, particular sector, for lack of a better word. It's possible.
Another question I had was in the Squibnocket and Menemsha systems, if you increase the flushing or the interaction between Squibnocket and Menemsha, are you able to kind of estimate to what extent that would degrade the water quality in Menemsha? You know, from trying to dilute what's going on in Squibby?
Yeah, I mean, I'd have to circle back to the folks from the hydrodynamics and water quality modeling team of the estuaries project to be able to answer that question. You know, being that Menemsha is as good as it is, and given the volumetric amounts that might be making its way into Menemsha compared to the size of like the bucket that Menemsha represents, it might not be that consequential. I don't recall what the actual exchange is volumetrically between Menemsha and Squibnocket to be able to compare that to, say, like the volume of the bucket that is Menemsha itself.
Right. But those estimations can be made in advance of trying to clarify.
Yeah, they could, and it could also very well be that quantitatively the water quality and hydrodynamic model could be used to actually play that scenario out, you know, where, okay, if we did modify the exchange and this much more water came out of Squibnocket on a given tide, what might that do relative to the concentrations in the immediate area of Menemsha? That can go, that question can be answered using the numerical model that was developed by the Massachusetts Estuaries Project. And I mean, it was developed specifically to be able to answer those types of questions, scenario runs.
Right.
You know.
Right. Thank you.
But it may literally be that it might not be as consequential as you think, just by virtue of the fact that the volume coming out of Squib on that portion of the tide, that ebb tide, compared to the volume of the bucket that is Menemsha, you know, it might not be that significant.
Thank you.
Sure. So Chris, I guess, or yeah, Chris.
Well, whoever is up above me had his hand up there for quite a while.
Okay, so that would be Gerard Hokinson.
Yes, thank you. Now, one of the questions I have looking at this information in some of the slides, the error bars, which I guess with these number of samples are probably min and max, are really large. And I wonder if we've had any discussions about factors that lead to what seems to be, if you look at the error bars, big increases or big decreases.
That's something that I didn't take up with folks from the lab at this point. I'm happy to. Part of it is because these samples are taken, different times in the summer, you can have noticeably different concentrations. They're really not so much error bars as much as they are min and max bars.
Right.
And so samples that were taken, say in August, could look very different than samples taken in June, or a sample taken in September could be very different than a sample taken in July. In a way, that's why we do multiple events in a given summer, not just one event or two events. We try and do 3, 4, or 5 events in order to ultimately be able to get what might be a decent representative average of summertime condition. So it's important to make the distinction between the fact that those are min and max, not like standard deviations.
Yes, I understand that.
Yeah.
One other question, I'm kind of intrigued by the information that you have on openings and the impact on the nitrogen levels. It kind of begs the question to me, kind of tracking back to habitat health. What's the true situation? If in fact when you close the pond and the nitrogen goes back up, is the habitat health going to continue to deteriorate, or is maybe having it open a certain period of time going to really help? So I don't know at this point in time that we would have information on that detail, but if the opening of a pond reduces nitrogen but doesn't have a positive impact on the habitat health, maybe it looks good, but it's not as good as it could be.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting question. I mean, you sort of started off by saying, like, having a hard time understanding like what's real. I think all of these systems naturally, like, let's just take people out of the equation. Let's just pretend we go into the Wayback Machine and now we're sitting on Martha's Vineyard and there's nobody there. These systems, year to year, would have sort of like a natural up and down based on the fact that they are opening and closing naturally over time. And, the habitats will generally, I think, be good because they are sort of in balance, but they will be dynamic in the sense that in some instances, depending on how well the system exchanges with the open ocean or the sound, habitat may be a little bit better, in some ways, or maybe a little bit worse. When you put people into the equation and you start influencing that nutrient regime, you automatically start tipping towards degradation, I think, because you're putting more into the system than the system naturally would have ever had. And then on top of that, if you sort of then layer on the variability that comes from exchange or the lack thereof, you potentially have a more aggravated impact to the habitat. Is it to say that if you open it, you won't have a positive effect on the impairment that you're seeing? No. Are we saying that if it's not getting open regularly, things will just continue to get worse? I think yes. So I'm having a little bit of a hard time understanding what you mean by not feeling like what's real. I mean, systems do take time to respond, and then year to year, as they get flushed more or less, that response is less clear or more clear. But the fact is, in a lot of instances, you're still getting load, so you're still going to be kind of teetering around, a clear and consistent improvement to the system. You see what I mean? I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, I guess like the point that I'm kind of driving toward in my mind is I would like to see whether the openings are really having an impact at the end, which is the habitat, as opposed to what seems to be a temporary influence on things
Right.
like nitrogen.
Okay, I understand what you're saying there. And in that case, you know, it would be necessary to go and do some of these measures of habitat health beyond just monitoring total nitrogen concentration and chlorophyll concentration. But again, that's something that you might do at a lower frequency than the monitoring itself. So like Sherry and I have been talking about in certain systems, like, which one was it? Lagoon? Tashman?
Lagoon or Tashmo, I think.
Lagoon or Tashman, where it seemed like things were kind of consistently staying on the low end of the spectrum. We start thinking to ourselves, wow, you know, here we go, Lagoon. Look at that. In all of these stations, we're seeing things trend down. Here's a little bit sort of flat, down, pretty consistently below the threshold. Maybe it's on time to really do a deeper dive beyond just what we collect in terms of concentrations and go, let's really take a look at habitat. Let's look at the DO. Let's look at the DO and let's look at the chlorophyll at a high frequency. And does it ever dip to below what is acceptable for healthy habitat? Yes or no? Over a month or 2 month period during the worst time of the year, which would be like, say, July, August, or August, September. Or let's look at the benthic fauna and let's look at the animals that are living there, and are these low concentrations year on year resulting in animals that are indicative of healthy habitat? So I agree with you, Jerry. I mean, I think that should be done in some of these systems. In others like Chilmark and Tisbury Great Pond, you know, it's a little trickier because it's so dependent on the openings. But if we were to see year after year concentrations that are gradually going down in Chilmark Pond or in Tisbury Great Pond, then you'd probably say, well, yeah, you know what, let's do that. Let's collect data that is more indicative of the habitat condition than just the concentrations. But what you see here is it's bouncing around all over the place above mostly the threshold, at which point you're like, how much value are we going to get out of the extra money that we spend to do a DO chlorophyll deployment, mooring deployment, or get benthic fauna? Well, we could, I mean, but it might just be that what it's going to tell us is that it's still impaired. You see what I mean? Only by virtue of the fact that these concentrations are so high and they're staying consistently above the threshold that we know it needs to be at in order to be supportive of healthy habitat. So maybe the focus should be on keeping these systems opened as well as possible to get those concentrations to consistently stay at a level where they may be supportive of healthy habitat. And then at that point, take a look and see. Does that answer your question? Chris?
Yeah, sure. Two things, several things. The first one is James Pond has no culvert. It's a meandering stream.
Okay.
And it always has been. And you can't make it bigger without lowering the pond. I mean, you could make it 6 feet deep and the pond would drop 6 feet. But it is what it is, and changing every year. They open it a little bit just to let the herring in and out.
Yeah.
But there isn't enough of a flush to make a big opening there.
Okay, well, that you bring up a very good point, which is that I guess you got to find a way to reduce the load to James Pond, because
Right.
if you can't flush it better, you know, then you don't have much of an option.
I agree. And so I've been listening to you and looking at this data, and I've been playing with it for a while. trying to figure out what it's saying or what we can take from it. And I hear every person for the last 50 years has looked at the pond and said, oh, we got to have more openings, bigger openings, better openings. And I know from personal experience and from watching lots of other people that the ponds have been pretty well managed, and they've had, the opening is what the opening is. It's not possible to make it suddenly bigger or better or last longer. There's too many variables. So when I look at the 2022 data, what it says to me is, hey, look, this was a year when we couldn't have openings, and it stressed all the systems because the opening thing has been pushed as far as it can be pushed. And when it fails a little, like it did in 2022, we didn't have any input of water into the ponds to speak of, the system failed. To me, what that data says is we should all be, running to our government authorities and saying, now is the time to cut down on the input of nutrients into the pond, nitrogen into the ponds. And here's the data that just says,
I couldn't agree with you more.
well, but that's what your data is saying. But all the time, what I'm hearing you say is better openings, bigger openings. I know the openings are, I mean, people have been opening those ponds longer than any of us have been alive, and they do it the best way that we know how to do it. It's not the solution. And
It's not, it's just a tool in the toolbox, that's all. And all I'm suggesting is that to the extent that you can use the tool, use it as effectively as possible, but it's not the only tool and it's not the only solution. You're absolutely right. I mean, the fact that the systems are impaired is really driven by the reality, which is that they're getting too much load. I get that. I mean, I get that. Load is very.
But how do we take that? How do we take that to the rest of the community? If everybody that looks at your data says, "Oh, we just got to improve the openings a little, and everything will be fine," we're never going to get there.
But that's not what I'm saying. And so they shouldn't misinterpret the message, which is that openings are helpful. Now, you can time your openings. Under certain conditions, an opening will be more or less effective. And we did a study on openings to figure out under which wind directions and wave conditions and whatnot do you get a better flush than others. So I mean, it's not just a matter of the water level in the pond driving the opening. It could be, all right, the water in the level pond is what it needs to be, but now what's the sea state? What's the wind direction? What's a number of different things that if we were to do it during optimal conditions, in addition to having the good pond water level, you'll get a better flush than if you did it not, And so that's all I'm saying. I'm not saying that you can necessarily make it do more than it can do, but you can maybe refine your opening a bit to get a little bit more effective flush. And I'm not saying either that is the end all solution, but these ponds are very sensitive to openings by virtue of the fact that they're getting a lot of load, and if they weren't getting a lot of load, they really wouldn't be as sensitive to it. What makes them sensitive to it is that they're brought to the brink of what's tolerable in terms of concentrations and healthy habitat. And so as a result, an opening can have a big effect, but it's by no means the ultimate solution and the only tool. It's not really fair to hang your hat entirely on openings when you know that the systems are getting too much load in the first place. And that's why we did the estuaries project. And I would continue to say that every municipality has to make the hard decisions using the estuaries project analyses on loading and all that to figure out how to reduce load. And they can't just lean on openings to solve the problem. because I don't think it will solve the problem. Is it a helpful tool? Yes. Might as well use it as best we can, but that's not the final solution. So I agree with you, Chris. I really do.
Well, so how do we get to the towns and the state and say, look, openings aren't a solution, they're just a Band-Aid? You know, we've
Well, I
been
mean, I think
open
that the
the
state,
pond
I mean,
for,
I think that
for
the
all these
state
years.
realizes that, because that's why they do the TMDLs. You know, total maximum daily loads are about load reductions, not about openings. You know, so the TMDLs really do demand and specify the need for load reductions. That's why they're called total maximum daily loads. And you have to have a plan for how do you achieve that TMDL, you know, but there has to be a commitment on the part of the, you know, the municipality that manages a given system that might have a TMDL to make progress towards achieving the TMDL. And achieving the TMDL, one tool in the toolbox are openings, but you still will have to find a way to reduce loads to varying degrees. So I think we're on the same page, Chris.
yes, I'm just trying to figure out how to sell it to the rest of the world.
Story of my life. I get it.
Roland, do you have any other systems? I'm sorry, Chris, are you finished?
Yes.
Do you have any other systems like our James Pond and our Squibnacet ponds that really have not much input from people? There's just not that many people living on the ponds, and that they're mostly from acid deposition. Is that where you would use, well, and these are also a problem because they have such high nutrients and they have so much high bacteria. A lot of times you can't put shellfish in there either. Do you have any other methods to clean those up?
No, I'd have to sort of talk to the group, you know,
Okay.
and sort of see, it's so site specific, you know, in terms of what, you know, what can be done, that I'd really have to just talk to the rest of the team.
Because like
John?
James Pond there's very few houses around James Pond. The watershed really has no contributions from people that much. It's mostly just the surface area, and it doesn't flush very well. But
Yeah.
like Chris said,
Well, you know, it goes back to something that I remember Brian saying when we were first starting the estuaries project, and it was like this need to understand baseline conditions and stuff like that before going off and making the big efforts to determine, you know, TMDLs and whatnot. Is like Green Pond was called Green Pond for a reason, going all the way back to whenever, before the beginning of time. The first people showed up there and they're like, look at that green pond, Jesus. And there it goes, gets the name Green Pond. Well, it's green for a reason. And it might just be that certain systems, the way they're structured, naturally are challenged from a habitat point of view. Yet we impose these water quality standards and stuff like that. And it may be that the water quality standard would say that this should be a certain water quality, and therefore we should do everything that we can to get it to that water quality. But in truth, going all the way back to before the beginning of time, it may have never been able to achieve that water quality because the system is not structured that way. And maybe James Pond is a system like that, you know. If you're saying that it hardly gets any load from the watershed, I mean, it gets some. Again, James Pond is difficult to talk about because we never, you know, did an estuaries project analysis on it. But James Pond may be one of those types of systems. I'll take a couple more questions, and then Sherry, unfortunately, you know, I have to get on with it. But I'm happy to.
yeah, John has been waiting. If you can take John's question.
Yeah, by all means.
Go ahead, John.
Thanks. Roland, thanks a lot for your talk and your good work. At the risk of possibly perturbing Chris Murphy, I'm going to talk about the opening of James Pond. That opening some years ago, it may have been more than 10 years ago, it possibly was following large or substantial rainfall. The pond level rose significantly, and that winding and meandering and definitely varying considerably over time in its location, albeit within a certain range. The opening blew out due to the volume of water in the pond, and it more or less cut straight from the larger opening closer to the pond out to Vineyard Sound. And the water roared out. It was visible current maybe 80 yards out. And I think John Powers was then the West Chisbury Board of Health person. And I actually probably stupidly waited out and got water samples for him. So the town may have samples of how unpleasant, how unpleasant that water was. But with respect to James Pond, I want to note something, and I'm an amateur on these matters, but it seems to me that in the case of James Pond, which is in the obviously of the North Shore, lateral terminal moraine, that perhaps unlike the Great Ponds on the South Shore and the outwash plain, there may be no real clear correlation between the total watershed that is relevant to the load that that pond gets and the topographic watershed, which elsewhere on the island is probably really what those two things are probably extremely well correlated. But as far as I know, nobody's done any kind of hydrological work. And so, for example, even though there are few houses around James Pond, there are some significant institutions with Title V systems that have been in existence for decades in West Chisbury, whose systems might possibly be emptying into James Pond, and in addition to houses that are further away. I mean, I'm sitting right now on the north side of Old House Pond, and the prevailing wisdom was always that the groundwater was flowing from Old House to Uncle Seth's Pond, and from there to James Pond. But that's just a notion. Nobody's ever done the work, and so I would say that it would be very useful to do that work at some point on hydrology or eco-hydrology, and also in aid of those two significant and flagged by the town as especially significant locations, Uncle Seth's Pond and Old House Pond. The other thing I want to ask as an amateur is with respect to the measures that you get, Roland, you're talking about averages, and are averages as opposed to spikes in, for example, nitrogen levels, the most significant measure for actual impact on, for example, the benthic fauna about which you've talked? I mean, is it possible that a spike could have more of an effect than a level that's just a bit above the threshold? And I also wonder how the threshold is determined.
Well, there's a lot
Thank
there.
you.
You bet. The average that we do is really to get a sense for the system as a whole during the summer, year to year. It's based on multiple events in a given summer. Obviously, that's the min-max bars around the average. With certain indicators of habitat health, like for instance, benthic infauna, it's not so much the spike at a moment in time that is really going to affect them. It's more this long-term average concentration that over time either gets lower, stays the same, or gets higher, that really drives the shifts in terms of the animals or the seagrass for that matter. And in the seagrass, I mean, for instance, like there may be a very high concentration on a given event that drives a bloom that affects the water clarity for a short period of time in a given summer. Is that going to wipe out the eelgrass? No, it's going to stress it for that moment in time, but it's not going to wipe it out. Now, if that were to keep happening all summer long, summer after summer after summer, that's going to really have a noticeable effect on the distribution of the seagrass and the habitat. And so that's kind of like why we do these averages and why we monitor as many years in a row as we do, is because it's that chronic pain that stresses the system and gets the system to shift. It's not the instantaneous thing that is the shock that, you know, breaks the camel's back. You see what I mean? Now, as far as the thresholds and how they're set, that's a long story. That is the Massachusetts Estuaries Project, the linked watershed embayment model that was utilized in order to determine the thresholds. And just very quickly, it looked at the watershed delineations for groundwater and surface water transport. It looked at the water use, the land use analysis, the load, the attenuated load. It looked at the bathymetry of the system, the circulation of the system. It looked at the load from the sediments. It looked at the load from the atmosphere. It looked at the loads from the ocean. It collected data on water quality baseline over 3, 4, 5 years in a row. It led to the development of numerical models for hydrodynamics linked to water quality to then be able to resolve concentration gradients that then were tied to indicators of habitat health and impairment, which is all the DO chlorophyll moorings, the benthic in-fauna data collection, the macroalgae distribution and density, the seagrasses. You put it all together to then quantitatively set thresholds for a given system that are specific to that system. So that's just a very, very quick summary of the Estuaries Project analysis. But getting back to your original point, which is there may be loads going into James Pond that are related to groundwater flow that is maybe not defined or driven by topography because of the geology. You know, it's very possible. And when we were doing the Estuaries Project and working with the U.S. Geological Survey, they did all the groundwater hydrology work and all the watershed delineation work. Those were things that we had to take into consideration for the specific reasons that you articulated. And it may be that the survey has done some work in the last, decade or so that might, be specific to the Vineyard and James Pond. I don't know the answer to that. That would show or render a little bit of clarity as to how water flows from the watershed to James Pond and where it might be catching load from. So I hope that answers your question, John. Yeah, what's up?
Roland, that is helpful. So I'm wondering, so if James Pond had been in the MEP from the beginning, would there have been more work done on that, on the hydrological side of things?
100%.
Okay.
We couldn't have done it otherwise.
But because it wasn't in for James Pond, that work wasn't done.
Correct.
USGS is
okay.
doing a study for us now on the hydrology. So that'll be out in the next year or so.
Oh, of James?
The whole island.
Ah, great. Okay. And then just as an ecological aside, I mean, I'm sitting on a kettle pond, a freshwater pond, and it used to have pickerel in it, the native pickerel, and they vanished. If they're pickerel in there now, it's because somebody dumped them in and not the state, which doesn't, as far as I know, stock pickerel. My understanding is that pickerel fry are much more sensitive than other freshwater fish to acid water. And so I have a hypothesis, which is that it's possible the absence of pickerel is due to a spike from rainfall that was badly timed as far as the pickerel were concerned. But the lack of that apex predator has meant the proliferation of smaller, in fact, non-native fish, but possibly hybrid of green sunfish and bluegills. And they are stunted. The adults are very small, and it's possible that their proliferation in numbers has meant that the zooplankton have been overly, as it were, consumed, and hence the proliferation of phytoplankton. So I'm just thinking, that you tweak one aspect of something and you can have a cascade of effects. So I'm sure that's something you all are considering with respect to brackish water. Anyway,
Yeah.
Thanks again.
You bet. Sherry, sadly, I have to run.
Okay, that's fine. If you could send me a copy of your slides, I will send those out along with the recording.
Yep.
Thank you.
That's fine. It was a pleasure speaking
Thank
with
you so
all of
much.
you. And thank you for your time and your questions and your care and concern for the estuaries of Martha's Vineyard. Let's just keep working it, you know, can't give up.
Okay. Thanks, Roland.
All righty. Take care
Bye,
all.
everybody.